High Altitude Dawn, Hindu Kush Mountains, 1987. The sky is a hard, pale blue, thinning to black at the edge of space. Below, the jagged teeth of the Hindu Kush tear at the atmosphere, their shadows deep and purple. At 45,000 feet, a lone Soviet Su-17 M3 fitter streaks eastward, a silver dart against the void. Its pilot, Major Alexander Gromov, scans his gauges. The air is too thin for contrails. Too thin, he has been told, for the Stinger missiles that have begun to plague his comrades at lower altitudes. This is a high-altitude reconnaissance run, a sanctuary. The only sound is the steady roar of his Tumansky engine and the crackle of static in his helmet. He feels isolated, sovereign. Suddenly, a low, urgent beep pulses through his headset. His gaze snaps to the radar warning receiver panel. A soft, amber light glows. His breath catches. It's not the simple search ping of a SAM site far below. This is a tracking lock. Sharp, insistent, and it's coming from nowhere and everywhere. He throws a glance over his shoulder, eyes scanning the empty cobalt expanse. Nothing. The RWR provides no bearing, no identification code, just the terrifying, singular fact of the lock. He pushes the stick forward, diving, weaving, dumping chaff. The thin air screams past his canopy. The beep does not waver. It holds him with a calm, electronic tenacity. For the first time in his long combat tour, Major Gromov feels a primal, vertiginous fear. He is not being hunted by a man on a hilltop. He is being tracked by an invisible, all-seeing eye from a realm beyond his reach. The sky, his domain, is no longer his. The rules of the war have just changed, and he does not yet know the new ones. This invisible revolution began not with a roar, but with a whisper in the corridors of power in Moscow and Washington, years before his flight. To understand the shock, we must first understand the sky he once ruled. To understand the shock, one must first understand the uncontested dominion of Soviet air power in the early years of the Afghan conflict. December 1979, the invasion was a masterclass in vertical envelopment. The thunder of Mi-6 Hook heavy-lift helicopters and the sleek, deadly shapes of Mi-24 Hind gunships filled the Kabul dawn. They swarmed over palace rooftops, disgorging Spetsnaz troops who secured key nodes in hours. On the ground, BMDs rumbled off Il-76 transports, but it was the helicopters that defined the visual and psychological landscape of the initial conquest. They were the steel fists of the Politburo's will. For the first 4 years, the Soviet Air Force, or Voyeno-Vozdushnie Sily, VVS, and its Army aviation counterparts operated with near impunity. Their mission set was brutally clear: support the crumbling Afghan communist regime, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, DRA, and pacify the countryside. The Mujahideen resistance, fierce and devout, possessed no credible answer to aircraft. Their arsenal consisted of Lee Enfield rifles, RPG-7s, and DSHK heavy machine guns, formidable against infantry and light vehicles, but short-ranged and largely ineffective against fast-moving jets and armoured helicopters. This asymmetry created a specific, dominating Soviet tactical ecosystem. Close air support, CAS, became a grinding, relentless hammer. The workhorse was the Sukhoi Su-25 Frogfoot. Its cockpit was bathed in layers of titanium armor, a literal flying tank. Pilots would descend into the valleys, hunting Mujahideen's supply caravans and mountain strongholds. They delivered bombs, cluster munitions, and napalm with terrifying precision. The sheer acoustic terror of a Frogfoot's dive, followed by the earth-shaking detonation, was a psychological weapon of its own. Above them operated the fast jets, the MiG-21 Fishbed, the MiG-23 Flogger, and the Su-17 Fitter. They conducted higher altitude strikes, interdiction missions against suspected supply routes, and reconnaissance. Their speed made them ghosts to the guerrillas below. They would be gone before the sound of their bombs even reached the ground. And then the true symbol of Soviet might, the Mi-24 Hind. It was not merely a helicopter, it was a psychological phenomenon. Mujahideen called it Shaitan Arbor, Satan's chariot. Its bulbous, armoured nose housed a Gatling gun. Its stub wings carried pods of 57mm rockets and anti-tank missiles. It could loiter, it could hunt, and it could transport troops. The distinctive thump, thump, thump of its rotor blades became the soundtrack of dread. A hind on the horizon meant retreat, death, and the undeniable power of the state. This air dominance allowed Soviet forces to project power across a vast, mountainous nation with a sparse road network. It compensated for their overstretched ground forces. Convoys moved under a protective aerial umbrella. Outposts were resupplied from the air. Reconnaissance flights mapped rebel movements. But this dominion was not absolute. It bred complacency and predictable patterns. Pilots began to feel like lords of the sky, following the same valleys, the same ingress and egress routes. They knew the Mujahideen's ceiling. What they did not account for was the will of an unseen enemy to change the very atmosphere of the war. The first crack in the armour appeared not from a new aircraft, but from a man-portable system. In 1986, the Central Intelligence Agency, through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, began supplying the Mujahideen with the FIM-92 Stinger missile. The shock of the Stinger is well documented. The downing of transport aircraft and helicopters skyrocketed, but the Stinger's impact, while severe, was tactical and localized. It forced changes in low-altitude tactics, higher approach speeds, more flare dispensing, night operations. It made the hind pilots wary, but it did not fundamentally challenge the VVS's control of the high-altitude environment. The Soviet response to the Stinger was a surge in electronic warfare, EWSO, and countermeasures. Aircraft were hastily fitted with new infrared jammers like the Lipa and Sirena systems. Su-25s grew strange, bulbous appendages to confuse heat seekers. The focus became surviving the terminal short-range engagement. This created a critical Soviet perceptual bias. By late 1986, the threat was defined as infrared, short-range, and ground-based. Their radar warning receivers were tuned for known SAM systems, the old SA-7s, the newer SA-14s, and the occasional ZSU-23-4 Shilka radar. The high-altitude realm above 15,000 feet, where the fast jets operated for reconnaissance and high-level bombing, was still considered a sanctuary, a place where a pilot like Major Gromov could fly his mission with a measured, if heightened, sense of security. This assumption was a fatal illusion. While Soviet aviation commanders were looking down, training their eyes and instruments on the mountain peaks for the telltale smoke trail of a Stinger, a different kind of threat was being assembled. It was not looking up from the ground. It was being lowered from the sky, piece by secret piece, into the very heart of the Hindu Kush. Its gaze was not thermal, it was electronic. Its range was not miles, but dozens of miles. And it could see not one target, but 6 at once. The transformation of the Afghan skies was not a lucky strike, but a deliberate, long-term strategy conceived in the conference rooms of Langley and Rawalpindi. This was the Great Game Reloaded, a Cold War proxy conflict where technology was the ultimate currency. The CIA's strategic objective, in close partnership with Pakistan's ISI, was straightforward: make the Afghan conflict as costly and unsustainable for the Soviet Union as possible. While arming the Mujahideen with rifles and mortars sustained the insurgency, it was the Soviets' overwhelming aerial dominance that allowed them to contain it. Breaking that dominance became the central pillar of the covert war. The Stinger was Phase 1, a brutal, effective shock to the system that degraded helicopter and low-altitude operations. But the strategists wanted more. They sought to contest the entire vertical battlefield, from the valley floor to the stratosphere. The Soviet high-altitude advantage was a particular problem. 5 and 70,000 feet mapped Mujahideen positions with impunity. Their bomber streams, though less precise, could devastate areas without warning. The Mujahideen had no answer to this. Early attempts to supply them with older, heavier anti-aircraft guns like the Swiss Oerlikon or Soviet ZPU-4 were of limited use. They were static, vulnerable to counterstrike, and ineffective against jets flying at the edge of their performance envelope. The solution emerged from an unexpected confluence of geopolitics and military surplus. Ally and a recipient of the most advanced American weaponry. The crown jewel of this arsenal was the Grumman F-14 Tomcat, a fleet of nearly 80 aircraft equipped with the terrifyingly advanced AWG-9 radar and AIM-54 Phoenix long-range air-to-air missile system. The 1979 Islamic Revolution transformed Iran from ally to adversary overnight. The new regime found itself in possession of this incredibly sophisticated fleet, but cut off from the technical support, spare parts and missile replenishment from the United States due to an arms embargo. Here, history presented the CIA with a unique and deniable opportunity. While direct dealings with the revolutionary regime were politically toxic, a complex, shadowy network of arms dealers and intermediaries emerged. The CIA, through its Pakistani ISI conduits, did not need the aircraft themselves. They needed the system, specifically the AIM-54 Phoenix missiles and, crucially, the ground readout and targeting components of the AWG-9 radar. The operation was a masterpiece of asymmetric thinking. The plan was not to create an Afghan air force. It was to ground-base the Tomcat's most potent weapon. Technicians, a mix of contracted Western experts and clever ISI engineers, worked in secure facilities in Pakistan. They reverse-engineered the necessary elements. The AWG-9's monstrous radar, capable of tracking up to 24 targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles, was not installed in a fighter jet. Instead, its key components were adapted into a semi-mobile, ground-based radar intercept officer (REO) station. Imagine a hardened bunker or a cave complex high in the Pakistani border regions. Inside, instead of a mujahid with a rifle, sits a technician trained to interpret the AWG-9's sweeping display. Before him is a screen that can see deep into Afghan airspace, painting a detailed picture of Soviet flight patterns, their altitude, speed, and heading. This was the God's Eye view, previously exclusive to AWACS aircraft, which the Mujahideen could never possess. But sight alone was not the weapon. The second, more audacious part of the system was the AIM-54 Phoenix missile itself. The Phoenix was a marvel of late 1960s technology, 13 feet long, weighing over 1,000 pounds, with a range of over 100 nautical miles. In its naval context, it was designed to defend carrier battle groups by destroying Soviet anti-ship bombers before they could launch their missiles. Its seeker head combined semi-active radar homing for the mid-course phase with its own active radar for the terminal kill. It was a fire-and-forget weapon on a scale never before seen. Adapting this for ground-to-air use was an immense challenge. The missile required a powerful radar illuminator to guide it initially. The system that was pieced together, using parts from the F-14's weapon system and other radar sources, was bulky, complex, and required careful emplacement. It was not a shoulder-fired weapon. It was an area denial system. It would be set up to cover a specific, strategically vital valley or supply corridor, places like the Panjshir Valley, the Khyber Pass approaches, or the logistics hub around Jalalabad. By 1986-87, this cobbled-together Frankensteinian system was operational. It was not a single unit, but likely a handful of precious, highly guarded installations. Their existence was among the most closely held secrets of the war. For the Mujahideen commanders, it was a sacred weapon, operated not by them, but by trusted Pakistani advisors or highly trained assets. Its value was not in how many missiles it fired, but in the shadow it cast. The stage was now set. In one cockpit, a Soviet pilot like Major Gromov, trained in a doctrine of centralized control and predictable threats, believing the high altitude to be his sanctuary. And on a mountainside dozens of miles away, a green radar screen glowing in a dark bunker, painting his lonely Su-17 with a calm electronic eye connected to a missile that could reach out and touch him from over the horizon. The two worlds were on a collision course, one born of imperial overreach, the other of covert technological ingenuity. This confrontation would be examined from multiple angles, not just in the cockpit, but in the laboratories, the spy centers, and the very philosophy of modern warfare. The Soviet pilot over Afghanistan was for years an executor of a brutal mechanical doctrine. His world was defined by checklists, prescribed altitudes, and known threat envelopes. He flew from sanitized bases like Bagram or Shindand, concrete oases in a hostile land. Pre-flight briefings focused on coordinates, bomb loads, and the known locations of DSHK guns, or, later, Stinger teams. The threat was below. It was localized. It had a smoke trail. His aircraft, while rugged and effective, embodied this philosophy. The Su-25's armor was a psychological blanket. The MiG-23's speed was a shield. Their avionics were functional, often analog, designed for the European theater of massive frontal assaults. The radar warning receiver, RWR, in his cockpit, a panel of lights and a crude audio buzzer, was his electronic sixth sense. It was programmed with the signature S codes of known NATO radars, the I-band pulse of a Roland missile system, the flicker of a Hawk battery. The mountains of Afghanistan were supposed to be electronically silent, save for the occasional pop of an obsolete SA-7. The first sign of the new threat was not an explosion, but an absence of information. Pilots began reporting anomalous RWR activity during high-altitude missions. It wasn't the sharp beep, beep, beep of a tracking radar, but sometimes a faint, unfamiliar strobe on the scope, or a lock warning that appeared with none of the associated identifiers. The system, baffled by a signal it was never designed to recognize, would often default to a generic, terrifying alert. POROC, gunpowder, the audible warning for a radar lock, would sound in a helmet when there was no visual or tactical reason for it. This bred a deep, corrosive anxiety. The psychology shifted from confident execution to paranoid vigilance. Where before a pilot's scan was divided between ground references and his instruments, now it became fixated on the RWR panel. Every unexplained flicker of a light was a potential death sentence. The sky itself felt contaminated. The sanctuary of altitude was violated. Tactically, the response was confusion. Standard Soviet doctrine for defeating radar-guided missiles involved aggressive maneuvering, diving to break line of sight and deploying chaff. But when the source of the lock was unknown, when it could be coming from a mountain ridge 60 miles away, from a direction his RWR couldn't even triangulate, these maneuvers felt futile, almost superstitious. A pilot would roll into a screaming dive, his G-suit tightening, only for the lock tone to remain steady and implacable, as if the unseen eye was tracking his every desperate move. Debriefings became sessions of shared unease. Some senior officers, wedded to the idea of technological inferiority of the Mujahideen and their backers, dismissed them as atmospheric anomalies or malfunctioning equipment. But the stories persisted, a chilling folklore growing in the ready rooms. The very predictability that had made them efficient now made them vulnerable. Their flight corridors, their habitual altitudes, their standard reconnaissance patterns, all of it could be, and likely was, being logged and analysed by that distant, silent eye. The human element was eroding faster than the aircraft. Fatigue, already a constant in a long war, was compounded by this new, intangible stress. The mission was no longer just about dropping bombs accurately. It was about surviving a gauntlet where the first warning might be the last. This psychological rupture, this transition from hunter to hunted, was the silent victory of the system before a single missile had even been fired. It was a victory achieved not by explosive force, but by the sheer, oppressive weight of information dominance. This dominance stemmed from a technological leap so profound it redefined the parameters of aerial engagement itself. To comprehend the shock, one must dissect the machine that delivered it. This was not merely a new missile, it was an integrated kill chain, a technological ecosystem that rendered previous paradigms of air combat obsolete. At its heart lay two components, the AN/AWG-9 fire control radar and the AIM-54 Phoenix missile. Together they formed a synergy that was, in the context of the Afghan theatre, nothing short of alien. The AN/AWG-9 radar. In an era when most fighter radars had ranges measured in dozens of miles and could track perhaps one or two targets, the AWG-9 was a monster. Its flat-plate, slotted array antenna, housed in the Tomcat's iconic nose, was mechanically steered and possessed a raw power that allowed it to see further and clearer than anything in the Soviet inventory. Its key capability was track while scan, the TWS. This was the revolutionary function. Previous radar systems required a pilot to lock a single target to guide a missile, illuminating it with a continuous radar beam. This painting of the target warned the enemy and consumed the radar's entire attention. TWS changed everything. The AWG-9 could scan a massive volume of sky, over 100 miles in range, and simultaneously maintain automated tracks on up to 24 separate targets. It could do this while continuing its search pattern. To a Soviet pilot, his RWR would not show the intense, focused beam of a lock. Instead, it might detect brief, scanning pulses that were so powerful they saturated his sensors. Or it might show nothing intelligible at all. The AWG-9 was observing him, building a track file, without announcing its lethal intent until the moment of launch. When adapted for ground use, this capability provided a Mujahideen or Pakistani controller with a situational awareness picture previously only available to a superpower. He could see multiple Soviet flights, a pair of Su-17s on reconnaissance, a flight of MiG-23s providing top cover, a lone Mi-8 transport skirting a ridgeline, all on the same screen as distinct tracked blips with data tags. He could see their formation, their speed, their heading. He was no longer reacting to the sound of jets. He was watching their strategic dance from a position of omniscience. The AIM-54 Phoenix. The missile was the physical embodiment of this reach. The Phoenix was not a dogfighting weapon. It was a strategic interdictor. With a published range of over 100 nautical miles, though effective range depended on altitude and engagement geometry, it could engage targets far beyond visual range of over the horizon. Its launch profile was apocalyptic. In a naval engagement, a Tomcat could ripple fire up to 6 Phoenix missiles at a spread of incoming bombers, each guided autonomously in their mid-course phase by the AWG-9's data link. The missile's guidance was a 3-act play. Act 1, launch. The AWG-9 provides initial targeting data via data link. Act 2, mid-course guidance. The missile flies a pre-programmed trajectory, receiving course updates from the launching radar. It is during this long, silent coasting phase that the target aircraft has no idea it has been shot at. Act 3, terminal phase. At a predetermined distance, the Phoenix's own small but powerful radar seeker awakens. It goes active, acquiring the target independently for the final, deadly plunge. Only in these last seconds, perhaps 15 or 20 from impact, would a Soviet pilot's RWR scream with the distinctive tone of an active radar homing missile. By then, at Mach 5, it was almost always too late. In Afghanistan, the ground-based adaptation meant this engagement sequence was initiated not from a moving, maneuvering fighter, but from a fixed, hidden site with a stable, unmoving radar platform. This increased accuracy. The system would be set to cover a vital approach. A Soviet flight, believing itself safe at 30,000 feet, would enter the lethal basket of the missile's engagement zone. The controller would select the lead aircraft or the highest value target on his godlike screen. A command would be sent. From a camouflaged launcher on a remote mountainside, a Phoenix would leap into the thin, cold air, arc over the peaks and descend upon its prey with the impersonal certainty of a guillotine. The technological shock was not just one of capability, but of concept. The Soviets were prepared for a knife fight. The enemy had introduced a sniper rifle with a telescopic sight. They were prepared for threats that announced themselves. This system killed from the silent, data-filled void. It represented the dawn of network-centric warfare, where sensors, shooters, and decision-makers could be disaggregated in the most primitive of battlefields. It was a future the VVS was utterly unprepared to face. The deployment of this future onto the battlefield was itself a feat of shadow warfare, a tale of covert logistics and strategic audacity. The journey of an F-14's weapon system from the deck of the USS Enterprise to a mountainside in the Hindu Kush is a labyrinthine tale of Cold War realpolitik, opportunistic arms dealing, and brilliant, asymmetric engineering. This was not a standard military aid package. It was a covert synthesis, a feat of geopolitical jiu-jitsu that turned the Soviet Union's own actions against it. The genesis lies in the Iranian connection. The F-14 sale in the 1970s was its pinnacle. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 created a paradoxical situation. A hostile regime sat atop a treasure trove of American military secrets, but with a finite, decaying stockpile of missiles and no means of replenishment. Embargo was absolute. The Iranian Air Force, however, maintained a core of F-14s, cannibalizing parts to keep a handful flight-worthy. Their AIM-54 stockpile was their crown jewels, used sparingly in the grinding Iran-Iraq war, primarily against high-value Iraqi aircraft like AWACS and bombers. Enter the network of intermediaries. The CIA, prohibited from direct dealings with Tehran, worked through a shadow world. Arms dealers based in Europe, the Middle East and Asia, motivated by immense profit and often with ties to multiple intelligence services, became the critical conduits. The trade did not involve whole aircraft. That was impossible to conceal. Instead, it focused on components, AWG-9 radar parts, test equipment, maintenance manuals, and, most critically, AIM-54 Phoenix missiles. These items could be disassembled, crated, and mislabeled. They moved via circuitous routes, ships to neutral ports, overland transport through permissive countries, paid for with cash drawn from the CIA's vast congressional-approved Afghan covert action funds. Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, was the indispensable partner. They provided the secure territory, facilities near Peshawar and Quetta, where the system could be reassembled and reverse-engineered. Pakistani engineers, some of whom had trained in the United States, worked alongside a small, deniable cadre of Western technical consultants. Their challenge was immense: to decouple the AWG-9 AM-54 system from the complex, moving environment of an F-14 and make it work from a fixed ground-based installation. This involved building stable, powerful power supplies for the radar in remote locations, creating a ground-based illuminator system to replace the Tomcat's own radar for the missile's mid-course guidance, hardening the systems against the extremes of mountain climate and the constant threat of Soviet reconnaissance or sabotage, developing a simplified, teachable interface for the operators, often Pakistani Air Force personnel seconded to the ISI or highly trusted Afghan technicians. The strategic rationale was profound. For the CIA, this was the ultimate force multiplier. A single, well-placed site could deny the Soviets use of the airspace over a critical region for hundreds of square miles. It protected the vital infiltration routes from Pakistan, the so-called bear trap valleys, where Mujahideen's supply caravans were most vulnerable to aerial interdiction. It wasn't about shooting down every aircraft, it was about creating no-go zones at altitude, forcing Soviet pilots to fly lower into the waiting engagement envelopes of Stingers and conventional anti-aircraft artillery. For the ISI, this served dual purposes. It directly aided the Afghan Jihad, a central pillar of Pakistani foreign policy aimed at securing strategic depth against India. But it also provided an unparalleled technology transfer. Pakistani engineers gained hands-on experience with one of the world's most advanced radar and missile systems. The insights gained into long-range radar tracking, missile guidance and electronic warfare would have incalculable value for Pakistan's own domestic weapons programs and air defense strategy for decades to come. The operation was a masterpiece of compartmentalization. Very few Mujahideen commanders knew of the system's existence or capabilities. It was operated and guarded by a separate, elite layer of the covert apparatus. Soviet HUMINT, Human Intelligence and Signals Intelligence, and SIGINT would pick up whispers of a magic weapon or long arrow, but the details were shrouded in myth. This secrecy was its armor. The system's power lay as much in the fear of its potential as in its actual launches. It created an invisible fortress in the sky, built not of stone and steel, but of data, radar waves, and the chilling possibility of a death arriving without warning from 100 kilometers away. And for the man on the ground who had spent years cowering from the sound of approaching jets, this system offered a transformative, almost divine new perspective. For the Afghan Mujahid, the sky had always been a source of terror. It was the domain of Shaitan, of the unbelievers' cold, mechanical angels. His war was tactile and intimate: the feel of rocky ground, the smell of cordite and dust, the close-quarters ambush in a narrow pass. The aircraft were abstract, impersonal forces of annihilation that descended from a realm he could not touch. He fought them with faith, grit, and weapons that demanded immense courage, creeping close enough for an RPG shot, or standing firm to aim a stinger as a hind bore down on him. His relationship with the aerial threat was fundamentally reactive and local. The ground-based AWG-9 Phoenix system altered this relationship at its core. It created a new kind of warrior, the ground controller. This individual, whether a Pakistani technician or a specially trained Afghan, was no longer a guerrilla. He was an operator, a master of a technological temple. His battlefield was not a valley floor, but a glowing green radar screen in the hushed, cool darkness of a bunker or a hardened cave. The sounds of war were replaced by the low hum of generators, the cooling fans of electronics, and the soft chatter of a secure radio link. His perspective was nothing short of divine. Where the Mujahid on the ground saw and heard only the aircraft that was directly overhead, the controller saw the entire aerial chessboard. On his screen, the Soviet flights appeared as bright tracked symbols: fitter, flogger, Hind, each annotated with numbers, altitude, speed, bearing. He could watch a pair of Su-17s take off from Bagram, track their journey eastward, and predict their likely target area half an hour before they arrived. He could see the Mi-8 helicopter flights resupplying a distant outpost. He witnessed the patterns, the routines, the ingrained habits of his enemy. This transformed the moral and psychological dimension of the resistance. For the first time, the Mujahideen possessed strategic foresight. A commander receiving information from the radar site could make decisions not based on guesswork or scouts' reports of aircraft that had already struck, but on real-time intelligence of incoming threats. Caravans could be halted, forces could be dispersed, ambushes could be set not just for ground troops, but for the recovery teams that would come after a strike. For the controller himself, the act of engagement was detached, clinical, yet imbued with immense power. Selecting a target on the screen was not an act of personal rage, but a cold, tactical calculation. The launch of a Phoenix was not preceded by the roar of an engine or the strain of physical effort. It was initiated by a command sequence, a button press. The missile's journey was invisible to him, tracked only as data on his console. The kill was confirmed not by a visual explosion — the target might be 80 miles away over the horizon — but by the sudden, singular event of a tracked blip vanishing from his screen. A symbol extinguished, a life, likely several, ended by his decision, enacted across a vast distance. This created a profound, almost unsettling asymmetry. The Soviet pilot experienced the terror of the unknown, of a threat he could not see or comprehend. The Mujahideen controller wielded the power of perfect sight, of a threat he could deliver with apocalyptic certainty, but would never personally witness. It was the ultimate abstraction of warfare. The personal, chaotic struggle of the guerrilla was now backed by the calm, removed precision of a technological priesthood. This shift had a paradoxical effect on the broader resistance's morale. On one hand, it was a tremendous boost. The existence of such a weapon, whispered about in cautious tones, affirmed that God was providing them with the tools for victory, that their great power backers were delivering not just bullets, but miracles. It was a symbol of their cause's legitimacy and inevitable triumph. On the other hand, it underscored a dependence on external, sophisticated technology that was entirely beyond the understanding or control of the average fighter. The magic came from outside, operated by outsiders or a select, anointed few. It was a step away from the purely indigenous, faith-based struggle, and a step into the realm of great power proxy war, where the Mujahid was both a holy warrior and a data point in a larger strategic game. This convergence of divine perspective and detached lethality set the stage for the system's ultimate test. The moment when theory would collide with reality, when a green blip on a screen would translate into a fireball in the high Afghan sky, and the stunned disbelief of a Soviet pilot would become an institutional crisis for the Red Air Force. The turning point was not a single cataclysmic battle, but a series of chilling, disconnected incidents that, when pieced together, formed a pattern of undeniable, terrifying truth. It was a psychological rupture spread across months, a creeping realization that metastasized in the minds of Soviet pilots and their commanders. The climax was the collapse of the sanctuary, early 1987. A flight of two MiG-23 MLD floggers streaks north at 36,000 feet. Their mission is fighter sweep, a show of force to clear the skies for a subsequent bomber run. The valley, a deep gash in the earth, is a known Mujahideen stronghold, but at this altitude they are untouchable. The lead pilot's RWR is quiet. Then a soft, unfamiliar strobe appears at the edge of his scope. A faint, scanning pulse that doesn't match any known SAM system code. He reports it to command as an anomaly. Moments later, his wingman, flying a kilometre to his right and slightly behind, reports a sharp, sudden lock warning. Poroch! The tone is urgent, clean. It lasts for 10 seconds, then vanishes. No missile appears, no radar-guided threat is observed. The flight completes its mission, but the debrief is tense. The wingman is adamant. It was a lock, not a search pulse. The intelligence officer logs it as a possible malfunction or an experimental Afghan DRA system. The seed of doubt is planted. Spring 1987, Jalalabad Supply Corridor, a high-altitude MiG-25RB Foxbat reconnaissance jet, a titanium skunkworks marvel capable of Mach 3, is on a routine mapping run. At 65,000 feet, it is in the stratosphere, a realm considered utterly immune to any Mujahideen weapon. In its cockpit, the pilot is a technician, monitoring cameras and sensors. His RWR, designed to detect the most powerful NATO airborne and SAM radars, gives a brief, powerful flicker. The signal is strong, pulsed, but unidentifiable. It is there and gone. The mission continues. The film is developed, revealing nothing unusual, but the signal report is filed upward, eventually reaching the desks of electronic warfare specialists in Moscow. They are baffled. The signal strength suggests a massive, powerful radar, but its characteristics don't align with any known NATO AWACS or SAM system in the region. The only system with that kind of raw power they know from intelligence briefs is the American AWG-9, but that is a naval fighter radar. The idea of it being ground-based in Afghanistan is dismissed as absurd. The catalyst. Summer 1987. The incident that shifts the pattern from anomaly to confirmed threat is shrouded in the fog of war and Soviet secrecy, but its outlines are clear from after-action reports and pilot testimonies. A pair of Su-24 Fencer-strike aircraft heavily laden with bombs are en route to a target deep in a border region near the Khyber Pass. They are flying at a medium altitude, around 25,000 feet, in a narrow corridor believed to be beyond Stinger range. The flight leader suddenly hears his wingman's panicked voice over the radio. "Lead, I have a launch warning!" The RWR is screaming the distinctive rising tone of a missile in terminal guidance, an active radar homer. The wingman initiates a violent, pre-programmed defensive maneuver, dumping chaff and flares in a desperate cloud. The lead pilot looks back, sees nothing. No smoke trail, no missile. Then a flash. A bright, silent blossom of orange and black against the pale blue sky, far behind his wingman's aircraft. The explosion is large, too large for a Stinger. The wingman's Su-24 is not hit. The missile has detonated at a point in space, its proximity fuse triggered as it passed. It was a warning shot, or a miss, but the message is received. The wingman's aircraft is shaken but intact. He reports no visual on the launch point. The missile seemed to come from nowhere, from over the horizon. Most critically, the radar signature of the terminal seeker is recorded by his RWR. The analysis back at base is conclusive and horrifying. The signal matches the known profile of the AIM-54 Phoenix missile's active radar seeker. This changes everything. Anomalous locks are one thing. The physical manifestation of a Phoenix, a weapon system that should be physically impossible for the enemy to possess, let alone deploy from the ground, is a seismic shock. The report rockets up the chain of command. The VVS in Afghanistan is now facing a weapon with a 100-kilometer kill radius, capable of engaging aircraft at the very limits of their operational altitude. The sanctuary is gone. The immediate tactical response is a wave of paralyzing restriction. New flight protocols are issued with urgent, classified priority. High-altitude reconnaissance and bomber routes are abruptly altered, forcing aircraft into less optimal paths and often lower altitudes. Loiter times over target areas are slashed. The previously routine practice of flying straight and level for bomb runs or surveillance becomes suicidal. A new term enters the grim vocabulary of the Soviet pilots: Phantomskaya Ugrozha, the phantom threat, named not for the F-4 Phantom, but for the ghostly, unseen nature of the killer. The psychological dominion of Soviet air power, carefully built over 7 years, begins to evaporate. The sky is no longer a place of control, but of vulnerability. Every mission into certain regions now carries the unspoken fear of the death that arrives without sound, without sight, from 100 miles away. The initiative, the freedom of the air, has been decisively seized by an invisible enemy. But the true climax is not just the fear. It is the stunned, disbelieving realization dawning on the Soviet military mind that their technological edge has been not just matched, but bypassed. That the enemy has weaponized information itself. The confirmation of the Phoenix's presence triggered not just new flight rules, but a systemic crisis within the Soviet war machine. The turning point was now institutional. It moved from the cockpit to the command bunker, from the pilot's gut fear to the staff officer's cold, sweating analysis. The phantom threat had a name and a signature, and it demanded an answer the VVS did not have. The first reaction was one of profound, frustrated intelligence failure. GRU military intelligence and KGB residencies were tasked with an impossible mission: find the physical system. Satellite imagery was pored over. Spetsnaz reconnaissance teams were given new priority targets: to locate and destroy large fixed radar and missile installations in the border regions. But the system's genius was in its minimal footprint. It was not a sprawling SAM-5 site like those in Syria. The AWG-9 radar, while powerful, could be housed in a modest camouflaged shelter or cave mouth. The missile launchers were not massive vertical silos. They were likely modified, transportable platforms that could be moved under cover of darkness. Finding them in the vastness of the Hindu Kush was like searching for a specific stone on a mountain. Soviet signals intelligence, SIGINT units, flying in specialized aircraft like the Il-20 Kut-A, redoubled their efforts. They hunted for the AWG-9's distinctive radar emissions. But the operators on the ground were disciplined. The radar would be activated in short, unpredictable bursts, just long enough to update tracks before going silent. This pop-up tactic, akin to a submarine snorkeling, made location and targeting nearly impossible. The Soviet electronic order of battle, designed to overwhelm and suppress known NATO emitters, was groping in the dark against a ghost. In Moscow, the analysis was even more unsettling. The PVO Strany Air Defense Forces, as their sources, the separate service responsible for defending Soviet airspace, was consulted. Their experts examined the data. The conclusion was humiliating. The technological core of the threat was American, but its deployment was asymmetric. The Soviets were facing a weapon they understood in theory from naval intelligence briefs, but one they had never planned to encounter in a counterinsurgency, launched from terrain it was never designed for. Their own frontline fighters, the MiG-29 and Su-27, possessed look-down, shoot-down capability and advanced missiles like the R-27. But these, the immediate aftermath of the Phoenix threat, was a palpable contraction of Soviet operational freedom. The sky over Afghanistan, once a canvas for their power, became a calculated risk matrix. The psychological and tactical shockwaves radiated outwards from the flight line to the planning rooms, altering the very character of the war's final years. New standard operating procedures, SOPs, became draconian. High-altitude transit corridors were abandoned or flown only at extreme speeds, burning precious fuel. The prize MiG-25RB Foxbat reconnaissance flights, symbols of technical prowess, were drastically scaled back. Their invaluable high-speed, high-altitude photography was replaced by riskier, lower-level passes by Su-17Rs, or even imagery from drones like the Stroy P, which were vulnerable to conventional ground fire. The quality of aerial intelligence, a cornerstone of Soviet operational planning, degraded. Close air support, the lifeline of beleaguered ground troops, transformed. Pilots were now instructed to pop up from behind terrain masks, release ordnance in a single hurried pass, and immediately dive back into the radar shadow of the mountains. The careful, lingering gun runs of the Su-25 or the multiple rocket passes of the Hind became luxuries of the past. This hit-and-run tactic saved aircraft but reduced effectiveness, often leaving Mujahideen forces battered but not destroyed. Ground commanders filed increasingly frustrated reports about the lack of persistent air cover. In the absence of a physical target to destroy, the Soviet response focused on electronic and doctrinal counters. The VVS Institute of Aviation and Cosmonautics and Specialized Electronic Warfare (EW) bureaus received urgent requirements. The goal? Develop a pod or modification that could spoof, jam, or decoy the AWG-9 Phoenix combination. Experiments were conducted with modified Sorbcia jamming pods, trying to broadcast false returns to confuse the AWG-9's tracking algorithms. Other efforts focused on enhancing chaff dispensing systems to create larger, denser clouds meant to seduce the Phoenix's active seeker in its terminal phase. Reports suggest limited, if any, success. The AWG-9's power and sophisticated signal processing made it resistant to simple noise jamming, and the Phoenix's own logic could often discriminate between a chaff cloud and the solid radar return of an aircraft, especially in the thin, clear mountain air. Perhaps the most telling effort was the clandestine attempt to acquire the technology itself. Through intelligence channels and arms dealers in the Middle East, the KGB reportedly launched operations to procure components or even an intact missile from the very stocks the CIA was accessing. The goal was reverse engineering, to understand the seekers' vulnerabilities. While there is no evidence a complete Phoenix reached Soviet hands, the attempt underscores the level of their concern. They were fighting a system whose inner workings were a black box. In the squadrons, a grim folklore solidified. The Phantomskaya Ugroza was discussed in hushed tones during debriefings. Pilots circulated Xerox pages, some real, some speculative, from NATO technical manuals describing the F-14's capabilities. These documents, acquired by GRU intelligence, became macabre bedtime reading. They learned the AWG-9's theoretical ranges, the Phoenix's flight profiles. Knowledge replaced blind terror, but it was a cold comfort. Knowing you were in the kill zone of a weapon that could reach out 100 miles was in some ways more stressful than facing a Stinger's 3-mile range. Official reports to Moscow, however, were often sanitized. To admit the full extent of the technological paralysis was to admit failure. The terms AWG-9 and AIM-54 rarely appeared in formal documents. It was politically and psychologically untenable to acknowledge the enemy's possession of such weapons. This created a schism between the lived reality of the frontline aviator and the bureaucratic reality in headquarters. The pilots knew they were facing a specific, demonic piece of American technology. This institutional reluctance had a direct cost. It slowed the allocation of appropriate resources and the development of effective counter-tactics. The insistence on viewing the war through a counterinsurgency lens, rather than acknowledging it had evolved into a limited, high-technology air defense contest, left the VVS playing catch-up until the very end. The strategic impact, however, extended far beyond the cockpit. It began to subtly warp the Soviet calculus for the entire war, contributing to a growing sense of inevitable quagmire. The long-term consequences of the Phoenix shockwave extended far beyond the immediate tactical retreat. It seeped into the strategic marrow of the Soviet war effort, becoming one of several critical, interconnected factors that poisoned the campaign from within and altered the future of aerial warfare. For a military built on the mythos of technological and ideological parity with the West, the encounter was a profound humiliation. The symbol of this was not a defeated tank column, but an empty patch of sky where a reconnaissance jet no longer dared to fly. The VVS, a service that took immense pride in its prowess, was forced into a defensive, reactive posture by a non-state actor. Pilot morale, already suffering from the bleeding wound of a protracted war, dipped further. The contract between pilot and command that they would be provided with technical superiority was broken. They felt like museum pieces thrown against a prototype from the future. This sense of technological inferiority contributed to the war weariness that infected the entire limited contingent of Soviet forces in Afghanistan. If they could not control the skies, how could they ever control the country? While no single weapon system decides a war, the Phoenix AWG-9 threat significantly increased the opportunity cost of continued Soviet operations. By 1987-88, with the rise of Gorbachev and the policies of perestroika and glasnost, the Politburo was engaged in a ruthless cost-benefit analysis of the Afghan conflict. The economic and human costs were staggering. The introduction of a weapon that made even routine air operations high risk added a new, heavy weight to the cost side of the ledger. Military planners now had to consider that any future escalation or major offensive would have to contend with these no-go zones. Securing them would require large-scale ground operations in some of the most forbidding terrain on Earth, against an enemy forewarned by the very radar they sought to destroy. The war was becoming exponentially more expensive and complex to wage effectively. The Phoenix, in concert with the Stinger, transformed the Mujahideen from a ground-bound nuisance into a multi-layered air defense network. This was no longer a counterinsurgency. It was a proxy war where the proxy possessed strategic-grade defensive weapons. The true legacy of the adapted system was demonstrative, with a brutal real-world case study in disaggregated sensing and shooting. The concept, where a sensor, the AWG-9 radar, could be hundreds of miles from the shooter, the Phoenix launcher, linked only by data, was a primitive but effective glimpse of the future. It validated theories that would later mature into the fully integrated, satellite-linked battle networks of the Gulf War and beyond. The Mujahideen controller in his bunker was a crude forerunner to the modern Joint Terminal Attack Controller, JTAC, who can call upon precision strikes from platforms over the horizon. For the Soviets, the lesson was equally stark, if bitter. Their military-industrial complex had focused on centralized, integrated systems like the Krasuka and Moskva EW complexes. The Afghan experience revealed the vulnerability of this model to a decentralized, adaptive, and commercially covertly sourced enemy capability. It highlighted a critical weakness in their military thought, an inability to rapidly innovate and adapt outside of massive, state-funded programs. The covert operation delivered a windfall to Pakistan's military scientific complex that cannot be overstated. The hands-on experience with the AWG-9 radar provided invaluable data on long-range surveillance, signal processing, and electronic countermeasures. ECCM. While Pakistan did not reverse engineer the Phoenix, the knowledge transfer influenced the development of their own strategic air defense and radar programs for decades. It sharpened their understanding of how to challenge a technologically superior air force, a lesson they would view through the lens of their rivalry with India. Pakistani intelligence partnership for the duration of the war, giving Islamabad immense leverage and strategic depth. When the Soviet Union began its final withdrawal in May 1988, the retreating convoys winding through the Salang Pass did so under a contested sky. The psychological assurance of absolute air cover was gone. The Phoenix threat, though likely not actively targeting the withdrawal to avoid provoking a final, devastating Soviet response, nonetheless represented the reason for the retreat. It was the material proof that the costs had become unacceptable, that the enemy had evolved beyond the Kremlin's capacity to respond. The skies over Kabul in February 1989, as the last IL-76 left, were not just empty of Soviet aircraft, they were permanently lost as a domain of Soviet dominion. The shock experienced by pilots like Major Gromov in 1987 was, in microcosm, the shock experienced by the Soviet system itself. It was a confrontation with a new kind of warfare, where information was the ultimate weapon, and technological surprise could be delivered from the shadows. The aftermath was a world where the rules of aerial engagement had been rewritten, not by a treaty, but by a missile that fell out of the clear blue sky. The story of the AWG-9 and Phoenix in Afghanistan is one of profound historical irony. A weapon system conceived in the 1960s to defend carrier battle groups against waves of Soviet bombers in the open ocean found its most impactful use 2 decades later, grounded in the dust of the world's most rugged, landlocked country. It was not used in the dogfight for which it was famed, but as a silent, area denial sentinel. This dissonance is the core of its lesson. The encounter represents a pivotal, if often overlooked, inflection point in the evolution of warfare. It marked the end of the sanctuary in a pure physical sense. For millennia, altitude and distance had conferred safety. The Afghan mountains were the ultimate expression of this. The Phoenix, guided by its all-seeing radar eye, collapsed that sanctuary. It announced that henceforth, no volume of airspace could be considered permissive unless verified by a deeper, more sophisticated kind of control. The control of the electromagnetic spectrum and the data flowing within it. For the Soviet pilot, it was the end of a certain kind of autonomy. The romantic, if brutal, notion of the individual warrior in his machine, mastering the elements and the enemy below, was shattered. He became a node in a system, acutely vulnerable to another unseen system that operated on a scale he could not perceive. His survival was no longer solely a function of his skill and courage, but of the invisible war waged between algorithms and emissions far from his cockpit. This was a quiet, psychological demotion from knight to target. Strategically, the episode was a perfect metaphor for the Cold War's final act. It demonstrated that the true battle was not merely of men or missiles, but of economic and innovative capacity. The Soviet system could produce immense numbers of rugged, effective aircraft, but it could not match the adaptive, modular, and covertly projectable nature of Western microelectronics. The United States did not need to deploy its own pilots. It could export a sliver of its capability, a weaponized algorithm, and change the strategic picture. The Phoenix in Afghanistan was a message in a bottle from the future of warfare, and the message read, "Innovation, not mass, will define the next epoch." Ultimately, the stunned silence in a Soviet cockpit, broken only by the panic of a radar warning receiver, echoes beyond the Hindu Kush. It prefigured the shock of stealth fighters over Baghdad, the bewilderment of tank crews hunted by drones in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the confusion of modern soldiers facing the pervasive eye of orbital reconnaissance. It was the moment the paradigm shifted from fighting what you could see to fearing what you could not. The war in Afghanistan ended for the Soviets with a retreat. But the lesson of the phantom threat lingered. It taught that dominion is no longer about holding ground or sky, but about controlling the invisible connections between them. In the clear, thin air at the roof of the world, the future of conflict quietly announced its arrival, not with a roar, but with the soft, insistent beep of a lock tone from over the horizon.